So, identity, starting with the subject of WAF this year. We work very internationally, and I was, when we were talking before, I said I have trouble explaining where I'm from, simply because I have multiple nationalities and have lived in different places. And so what this means is that we are quite flexible in terms of going to different places and trying to understand what it means to build abroad. But what really this means is that we every time approach a project from a different cultural or political perspective, the social aspects of where we work, the climatic, the site aspects, all start to inform the project, whether we like it or not. And a lot of the foreign projects that we work on, we try to get architects in the office that are culturally from the place, so that we can go through this great learning curve of having to work in different places. And so I think that I once read a quote by D.H. Lawrence, who was talking about writing a book, and he said that sometimes you have to let go of the author and let the story take over and see where that takes you. And I feel very much that our projects are like that we start in a certain way of working or thinking, and then something from the place or from the people that we are working with means that we're going to go in a different direction, and we never really know where this will take us until the project is quite well advanced. So talking about identity and what building structures do to identity, they can become the icon of a place. This, as you all know, was a structure that was supposed to be demolished. Sydney, the Sydney Opera House, which was designed by Utzon, who was eventually fired from the project, but it became not just a symbol for Sydney, but really the symbol for Australia itself, and such a strong presence. Bilbao, the building, made the place, essentially. I don't think that people had really knew of Bilbao before Frank Gehry put his building there. But interestingly enough as well, this fact that this building, which was supposed to have cost so much, bought so much economically for the place, and really created a whole area, regenerated a whole area of Spain that wasn't so thriving as it is now. And this is Saarinen's chapel in MIT, and when I was first taking my first architecture classes, this is a place that I would come to. This is the first project I had to draw, but there is something in terms of the identity of MIT. This is always what I think of, a very small, simple structure, very elegant, in a sense, very iconic, and so everlasting and present in MIT, and I still think it's sort of the epicenter of the campus. So it's I think the way buildings create identities for places, as well as are formed by places, is quite important. Obviously, there's also the question of cultural identity. The Apple Park that some people here worked on, it's a very closed-off structure, a very internal-looking structure, but a very strong shape for a cultural identity of Apple. And then you can go to the more ridiculous, we would say, in terms of cultural identity. This is a tea museum in China, and sort of trying to probably be a little bit too literal about what they are trying to do. And then there's obviously the identity of the architect, and I think that Zaha unashamedly was always Zaha in terms of the way she presented herself, and sometimes it worked very strongly, and sometimes it sort of became a little bit more contentious. And this was the Tokyo stadium for the 2020 Olympics, and there were lots of critics that sort of called it an identity crisis. So there are many factors really that start to inform what the identity of a place or the identity of a building will have on its place, and vice versa. As you can see, we work very internationally. That probably had to do with the fact that we started the office in 2006. In 2008, the crisis happened, and so if we stayed working in the UK, we wouldn't have built very much. So we kind of went abroad and had projects all over the world, and that's been, I think, very interesting. It's been challenging, but it's been very interesting as well. And so I'm showing you here a few projects, and I selected the projects because they are all so incredibly distinctive from each other, and especially the place where we are working. So Zimbabwe, Switzerland, UK, Lithuania, Egypt, UAE. So they are all culturally, politically, very, very different places, and therefore this has informed the building. So the first one is Zimbabwe. This is the Gotterdam House. This was the first project we had that launched the office. Zimbabwe is a politically broken country, politically and economically, and that really informed the project in many ways. We had this spectacular site where we were sitting on top of a rock with a 50-meter cliff in front onto this dam that this was a big tobacco farm 1 hour north of Harare. And the client wanted to build a house there, and he essentially employed 1,000 workers. Each worker supported 10 people, so that means that the farm supported 10,000 people. That was really his security in terms of trying to retain the land and not having it taken over by the government. And so he wanted to show that he was building something ambitious and he was here to stay. The site was one big foundation. It was one big rock on which we built, and it had these wonderful views, and we wanted to build something that was really between the sky, the views, and the rock, and reflect this the strength of this site. The plan is very simple. There's one enclosed living room on one side, and then there's an open living room on the other side. Underneath the enclosed living room, there's the master bedroom and children bedrooms, and on the right-hand side, some guest rooms. And then there's a study, there's a little school, a classroom for the children, because there is no school around, so we had to sort of integrate a tiny little school in there for the children. But essentially, we tried to excavate as little as possible. Every time you put a bathroom, you had to get a piece of dynamite and blow the rock. So we tried to touch the ground as little as possible, and then essentially have these very large roofs, canopies floating, apparently structurally above the site to shade the site from this very vertical sun. The biggest issue here was that we designed the building in 6 months, and it took 6 years to build because we were dealing with hyperinflation. We went from Zim dollars to US dollars. It's sort of, nobody knows how much this building cost because it was paid for in fuel and in wood, and so there was all sorts of bartering happening. And the biggest issue was really to find materials. So we tried to not import anything because the prices would immediately go up because this was Zimbabwe. And so we tried to do everything locally. And the only thing we really imported was the waterproofing and the glass. And the rest was all sourced locally and as much as possible sourced from the site itself, just to reduce this inflation costs. Labor was very available. There wasn't, most people weren't working. And therefore there was a lot of labor available. In terms of the quality, there weren't any skilled workers, so we ended up doing a lot of the mock-ups on site and trying to teach ourselves and teach them how to pour concrete or how to build these things because there was no skilled labor. Here you can see the roofs that are being designed. Built on site with these massive cantilevers and this idea of really having this very light and floating roof up above. This is during construction. These photographs happen over periods of years because it was such a slow process of building. The excavation here, you can see the dynamite marks on the ground and how the the rock would fall out, and whatever we excavated, we would then reuse on the facades, just not to have to build, to buy any material and source everything locally. The gutters we designed and formed out of this rock. So everything was really sort of whatever we took from the ground, we used for the building itself. This is the client with outside of her bedroom with this reflecting pool that connects to the dam below. Anyway, some of the pictures. It was a wonderful project to work on in terms of as architects, we practically had to be builders and go on site and understand how we could build in a place that was so economically broken. The sinks we designed as well. We couldn't buy sinks, so we just designed the sinks and just imported the taps. So it was a fun, interesting project. Wellington College just opened recently. This is our UK project. This is in a school. They had they needed an assembly hall. They currently had the 1,200 students and staff were in 3 different buildings, and they wanted one place where everybody would gather together. And so we were trying to find a building or an architecture that would link the historical campus, grade 1 listed buildings, and the modernist campus, which was, in our mind, much less successful than a historical campus. And how do we link these two together? Because for the moment, they had a very unhappy coexistence. We were on the edge of these two kinds of qualities of architecture. Also, the school had developed this new way of teaching, which is a Harkness model, and it was much more about community and about gathering, and this assembly hall was about this community and gathering. And so really understanding the culture of the school and what they were trying to do, it was a school that sort of became much more successful, and they're very ambitious, and so we wanted to reflect this idea of wanting to create this communal space. One of the existing theatre of 350 seats had this, what I call the bear pit. It's essentially a connection between the different levels. Performing arts is all about levels. How do you connect the stage with the stage in and out, the balconies, the stalls, etc. So this was a solution that the architect from the 60s had presented and was, in our mind, very unsuccessful. The brief of the competition was essentially to put a foyer in the bear pit and then put the assembly hall next, adjacent to the existing theatre. And we felt that this was totally the wrong solution, because you'd still have this level problem and you'd still have to go down into the bear pit, and you'd still have this disconnection from level 100, which was the main campus. And so we proposed something much more gentle, a gentle slope that went in between the existing theatre and the new assembly hall. And by creating this ramp, we would connect the school and this big forest, the Bracknell forest, a very important forest around the campus, and allow the campus, the forest, and the cultural new cultural quarter, or what we call the cultural living room, to all be interconnected. These were the early diagrams. We only were given a week to do this competition, so it was pretty hectic, and the good thing about that is they didn't allow us too much time to overthink it, and it became sort of very intuitive and very fast in our response. But this was the notion of the cultural living room and a soft connection between the different levels of the campus and the street behind it. And then the idea of the round theatre really became from this idea of connectivity and assembly, the importance of having all the students together and seeing each other and being close to the stage. A 900-seat auditorium in a school is very overwhelming, and we wanted a very intimate connection between the stage and the audience. The cultural living room is a space that we created so that the students could really take over and create gigs, concerts, exhibitions, etc. And the auditorium itself, the notion of a round space and natural light into the space was a guiding factor. One of the things that was really important for planning is that this is such a massive building next to the historical buildings, and we wanted to make it appear as light and as floating as possible and as part of its context as much as possible. So we created this perimeter circulation that made the building look much smaller, much lighter, and as if it just was hovering over its site rather than imposing itself on the site. and this is the cultural living room, and seen from the inside, and you can see now a much more gentle connection with the campus rather than this very steep bear pit. It's seen from the forest, so actually from the parking, you can approach it from the back and from the forest. We chose a charred wood kind of approach for the cladding of the building. The budget was incredibly tight, so we were always trying to find solutions that were cost efficient, but also this sort of rustication of the edge and making it feel as if it was really emerging from the forest and being a bridge between the forest and the more formal campus of the historical buildings. And you can see here, this is the opening, which was about a month ago. And this connection of the two circulations, inside and outside, very dynamic when people are coming in and moving up. And that was the first day of the opening. Gooch in Andermatt, this is we have a client, we're doing 4 projects with him. He's an Egyptian client who develops resorts, and this is a resort in Switzerland that he's developing. It's a small, I mean, this is our smallest project with him, but it's a little bit of a jewel of a project. The site sits, the Andermatt is a military town where the Swiss military pulled out and suddenly had an identity crisis. They didn't know what they wanted to become, and so they approached this Egyptian developer who does resorts and said, how do we turn this into a resort? And he took it over and is now developing it. And it's quite an extraordinary thing to think that the Swiss would go to an Egyptian to do this, but it's been very successful. He speaks perfect German, so it's all culturally works very well. We're doing a concert hall for him in town, where we just found out the Berlin Philharmonic is going to open it, so I'm very excited. That's finishing in March, but I'm not showing this project. I'm showing you the smaller project at the top of the mountain. This is a 2362. It's a site which is between a chairlift and a gondola in front of a major avalanche run, and it's the season for construction is about 6 months. It has very high winds, so it's a very complex site in terms of location and elements. And the people who built the ski lift and the chairlift were very grumpy Swiss guys who just completely ignored the fact that we had to put a restaurant there, and they just squeezed our site as much as possible. And you can see that little mound of mountainous little igloo that they built last winter is the site of the restaurant. But what you can see is that immediately it goes very steep, and so we had quite a challenging site to work on, and having to deal with the setbacks from the gondolas, etc. This is seen from the plateau at the top. And you can see the kinds of views in summer and in winter. It's very abrupt, it's very beautiful, it's very monumental, and something that we loved and reacted to. I grew up in mountains, so it's all very familiar and very lovely. But this awesomeness of the mountain and capturing this atmosphere and feeling that you are on top of the world is something that we wanted to capture in this project. And this feeling of being from the inside, when you walk into a place in the mountain, it always feels very dark, and then you go to the outside and it's overly bright. You're usually on top of the clouds, so it sort of has this sense of awesomeness. The massing, the Swiss Amour, these are villages that formed in the mountains, which in the summer, the villagers will go up with their cows and form little villages for 3 to 4 months of the year, where the cows come and graze up in the mountains, then come back in the winter down in the valley. And this very simple architecture of stone and shapes of buildings that are rotated and are similar and are replicated is something that we wanted to react to. And you can see here the roof formations really become the language of it, and the solidity and the lack of windows is something that is quite typical of this kind of architecture. And these are only things that you really see when you go up hiking or skinning on the mountains. And then we found this sculpture that we liked, and we felt that this idea that the building should really grow out of the rocks, grow out of its site. And we started doing some massing studies. This is in 2 phases, so the final phase of the building will have 5 blocks, and we start now with 3 blocks, and when Andermatt develops further, we'll add another 2 blocks. But these 3 blocks of rocks which emerge from the ground and have these oversized windows cut into it. And then these balconies that we really tagged onto, because this is not something that is part of a typical traditional Swiss architecture. This really came with tourism when you wanted balconies for restaurants. And so it's not part of the architecture. So we made it obviously as adds-on rather than coming out of the buildings. And created these quite monumental vertical buildings that you really, these pictures actually should be all taken from the lower part, because only the birds will see this. You really experience this building from this angle here, and you can see these rock formations coming out, these rock blocks coming out of the building, and the windows, these oversized windows, is also very atypical of the traditional Swiss architecture, so we made it very obvious with these precast concrete window frames, which are very opposite to the natural stone cladding. And then these tag-on terraces with a very light structure underneath. We did these columns which are sort of haphazard, but actually it helped enormously, because what we discovered when we started excavating is that there were a lot of army bunkers underneath, and so we were able just to move around the columns to accommodate and not go into these army bunkers. And you can see it. It's quite, the scale of it is quite large, and you'll see some of the construction pictures. This is coming out of the gondola onto the entrance. This is one of the entrances. There are 2 entrances, gourmet and family restaurant. And we were really trying to find a stone and a language of materiality that emerged from its place. And these are pictures that were taken around the site. And so we replicated this very natural, haphazard kind of stone cladding. The building has to be, we have very short seasons. We have 6 months to build, so we've now built the foundations, and the next season we are hoping that in 6 months we can get the superstructure, the roof, and the interiors done. So it just all depends on the weather. But everything is prefabricated, CLT, assembled on site as quickly as possible, so that we can build in very, very short seasons. So very small plan, 3 interlocking blocks with the vertical circulation at the intersection of these 3 blocks, and then these very large terraces for dining, and then down we have very large basements because of the slope of the restaurants, and this is where you have we have enormous snow storage machines, and you have to bring in the air and bring it through a room and then bring it into the building because of the snow within the air. So there's all these requirements that are needed, and you can see here this dialogue between the added-on terraces and these very thin structural elements. These are now, the terraces are protected from the avalanche side, so they can be much more light and whimsical, whereas the other side, which is the avalanche side, is very strong and stone-like. And from the inside, this notion of expansion of the space with these very large windows. This is the site. It's quite awesome. So this was this summer, and this is purely the foundation. So where the green man is standing is where the terraces will be, and then the restaurant is above that. And you can see some of the views from the rooms. It's all quite awesome. And I just took this video because there's something. I mean, the Swiss builds it with such quality, and it's such a pleasure. But there's something so calm about these building sites up there, and it's done with such precision and calm, and it somehow works so beautifully. And I just sat there for an hour watching them work, and it was just sort of Swiss clockwork, very beautiful. So Vilnius, this is a project that will kill me, I think. We started this project in 2008, and now we've been working on it for 10 years, and they think there's another year to go. I think there's another 3 years to go. Lithuania is a country that, when we came there, it had only really existed since '91, because before that it was under the communist rule, and so the whole planning parameter was very new. The mentality was very deflated, and we were working with a local architect, and whatever we showed to the local architect and to the client. The local architect said, no, it can't be done. No, it can't be done. We'll never get planning for it. And so it just wasn't moving anywhere. And then finally I asked the client to give me 6 months to trust us and let us give a shot at this planning. And so we hired a young Lithuanian architect out of a bar in Dublin. I can't remember how we found him. And he translated these books of planning. And then we really approached the planning from an outside perspective. And this is a World Heritage Site. It's a UNESCO protected site. So that helped us enormously because we were able to take the UNESCO treatises and start arguing that way. And we were saying that this is the state of the buildings that we inherited. These beautiful, very simple Baroque, but very dilapidated and had been left. It used to be a cardinal's palace, then it became a venereal disease hospital during the communist times, and then it was in disrepair since '91. And so we had to argue, essentially, these were the only historical drawings that we were given, but you can see this Lithuanian Baroque. It's not like the Viennese Baroque, which is, this one is very simple. It's always been a very poor country, and so you've got this very large roof and this very simple, minimalist building below it. And so we wanted to keep this idea of simplicity on the site, and we wanted to take away what had been added through times and restore the original Baroque and then get rid of the later classical periods. And I'm not going to take you through all of this because it will take too long. But and then for the new build, we looked at this as insertions rather than extensions, and that was a very important part in terms of planning perspectives. So we then approached the planning department, and we approached it from a very pragmatic way in terms of saying that whatever is old we should restore and bring it back to its former quality, and whatever is new should be obviously new. It's a mixed-use scheme, so it has cultural offices, residential, gallery. It has a large spa of 1,600 square meters. But I guess the use is a little bit less. That was more to sort of bring some of the regeneration from the center to there. So we kind of created this mixed-use, vibrant space. But this notion of the new builds within the building was the most contentious part to pass through to the planners. And so we approached this and we said, look at the Alhambra, where landscaping and building form one unified element, and you cannot distinguish one from the other. And the Lithuanian palaces or the Lithuanian buildings were always landscape courtyards and buildings. And so we played with this notion of reflection and landscaping and buildings that were somewhat between being a landscape building and a building itself. And so we used the notion of reflection, and you can see this is you know, the uses as a tower, fire egress and a lift tower that we didn't want to put inside the building because we would demolish some of the important Baroque, so we brought it to the outside, and through this reflective stainless steel elements, we essentially reflect the Baroque rather than copy it. And so we play with the historical buildings, we give a nod to them, but we are confidently a new element. And so when they understood that, they agreed to create a new build within the historical landscape, which by planning wasn't technically allowed. The roofs were a very important part, and one of the guidances in the planning said that the roofs in the old town had to be clay, and we argued that actually, oh wait, sorry, I wanted to show you this. This is the rendering with the sky moving, but what this building really becomes is it becomes landscape and sort of disappears, and the solid material disappears, and the transparent material, which is the glass, really becomes much more solid. And the tower is up, and the panels are there, and I think it'll be installed in the next, who knows with them, year or something. So this is the tower. And we did the same for the restaurant. So we essentially excavated an auditorium. We wanted to create some kind of performance space and a restaurant, something quite vibrant. And then roofing it, we put this stainless steel roof on top of it that reminded of a reflective pool. This is actually now up. I was just there last week, and it looks very exciting and great and reflecting its surroundings. These are the panels that were made in Japan, and then beautiful craftsmanship, and then taken over and shipped to, this is them going off to Lithuania. The roofs were one of the most difficult part to pass through. Because of this argument from on the planning side that the roofs had to be clay, the Baroque has the ability to have 1 or 2 additional floors in there. And so what's been happening in Vilnius is that they've had Veluxes going on all buildings. And we argue that actually Veluxes were a radical thing in the 50s, but it's still a radical thing. It doesn't work with the Baroque. It actually breaks this idea of the Baroque. And really what you want to do is to restore back to the Baroque idea of a solid roof and a solid base. And so we argued that actually if you put a trellis of aluminium roof with skylights behind it, you are able, and by putting the glass behind a roof, you don't have this blue reflection of the glass, you're able to recreate the solidity of the Baroque roof. And this is a mock-up that we did. And then we bought this mock-up on site, and it took them a while to agree, but once they saw the mock-up, they accepted it and even changed the planning regulation to suit this project. And this is earlier on one of the roofs. Now most of the roofs are up. This is the excavation that we had to do, and they are quite brutal the way they build over there. Like, I was always worried that the whole thing would collapse. But it's interesting to see how the layering of time happens, and how we are revealing a lot of this Gothic, classical, and what we call the SSA period, but sort of what happens to the buildings over time. And you can see the state of the buildings being restored. I think I'm running out of time. I'll just show you this one and then I'll stop, because this is, I like this one.
Minutes. The clock's not right.
Oh, good. Thank you. Alexandria. This is a scheme that we were asked to do by our client in Alexandria. And as it turned out, it's not going to happen in Alexandria. It's going to happen somewhere else in Egypt, because they liked the scheme so much. But the site in Alexandria didn't work, but they had another site and they want to do a concert hall. So this was designed as an opera, and now we're going to use a similar concept as a concert hall somewhere else. But I'll show you this one because it's an interesting story. But Alexandria is a spectacular place which is in complete disrepair, and actually it's sort of, your heart kind of breaks when you go there. It has this sort of wonderful historical element to it. But one of the things is that this was Cleopatra's city, and if you look at the plan of Alexandria, to me it looks like Manhattan. It's sort of a very early example of Manhattan, and this gridded city with an enormous amount of Ptolemite culture, and through tsunamis and earthquakes, it eventually sunk. This is the site. You can see on the left with this famous port, the old port. But when the city sunk, what's been happening in the last 20 years is that they've been finding these unbelievable sculptures in the water. And there's a French archaeologist that's been going around and finding these sculptures. And there was a famous exhibition that went around, was at the British Museum, called Sunken City, Egypt's Lost Worlds. And that is literally where our site was. So we thought, well, we're doing an opera, but we can't ignore this history on the site, and we've got to sort of adapt the idea of this building. The site itself is surrounded by a lot of history and a lot of very strong buildings with very strong presences. The Ras Al Khaimah Palace was the presidential palace, which now belongs to the army, or this is the army campus around it. Nobody can see it. It's literally walled around. You can only see it on the internet. There is a mosque that was a very important presence on our site, so we reacted to the mosque. There is a citadel where originally the lighthouse of Alexandria used to be, one of the 7 wonders of the world, so another very important site. And then the Alexandria Bibliotheca Alexandria, which was built, I can't remember when, but this century. This is the edge of our site, and if you look at the the buildings of Alexandria, you can see that all of them are slightly kind of all falling to one side or the other, and that's because underneath there is an enormous amount of cistern that were built during the Cleopatra city's time to bring water from the Nile into Alexandria, and the foundations weren't sort of properly thought out. So you can see this sort of high-rise city that is slightly precarious in terms of, you wonder how it really all stands up. And then this very strong presence of the Ras El Tin Palace with its arches adjacent to the site, and then literally next to our site, this mosque, which was the only important cultural building adjacent to it. When we were trying to think of how to approach this and what kind of language we should be adopting, we looked at Moorish architecture and discovered that the arch was actually invented by them, and so we decided to go into the research or the language of the arch, which opens up a myriad of possibilities. And so that was, one of the reasons for the arches at the edge of a building is always for shading and cooling of the building, so it sort of seemed very natural that this would be something that we should approach. And then the other thing about Egyptian architecture is that they have this sense of scale, which is quite extraordinary. And if you go to Luxor, you're confronted by the sense of scale, and we thought that we should react to that as well and see how we could interpret scale in a different way that we are used to. So we did a master plan around. I'm not going to take you through the master plan, but essentially it's on a Mediterranean site, so a lot of water surrounding the site. And we also had to create a buffer zone between the military restricted zone and the public space. And so we brought the water around our site, and we created a very large reflective pool that meant that the opera felt as if it was sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean and was part of the water. And this idea of bringing the sunken city back up and onto the site. And then a direct adjacency with the mosque. Proportionally, the two buildings turned out to be quite similar, so we thought that a dialogue between the two was something appropriate. And we placed the auditorium and the stage. This is an opera house, so we have very large volumes of fly towers and side wings and back wings. And that really informed the volume of the building. And then we wanted to enclose the foyer and have something that was very open and yet very shaded, that would create these views to the Mediterranean and into the foyer. And we started playing with the idea of arches around the buildings and how we created these arches. We decided that rather than placing the arches next to each other, we would stagger them and see what that would start creating. And you can see here how we started forming the arches and the kind of scale that we were getting and the kind of practically Gothic architecture that we were getting out of it. But just by staggering it, it created a new interesting language. And then we suggested to the client that this should not be an opera, it should be an opera and a museum for the sunken city, and that they should bring some of these artifacts, these beautiful sculptures that they are discovering in the water, and bring them back and have this as a building that could show them. And we wanted to showcase these sculptures within the water. So this is the approach, and you can see here how the scale of the building and the scale of the sculpture and all work very much together. And this is a western-facing view, so you get the sunset right behind the building, and this reflecting pool around the building means that it's very much part of the Mediterranean. And here the columns are, some of them are 27 meters, some of them are 20 meters. You can see here the elevations, very simple elevations, and just sort of a play with scale and enclosure. And here we have the plan. We had multiple access points, both for security reasons and here.
Running over time.
That's it. I'm done.
Is this the last one?
I'm not going to show you the last project.
Okay. Well, we've got 10 minutes of chat, so you can prepare your questions, but I'm going to talk first. I think you're a good skier.
Thank you.
You do ski, don't you?
I do.
Are you one of those skiers that can ski on one leg?
My father was British champion and went to the Olympics. So we grew up on skis.
I bet. Well, the rock of Switzerland, the mountains, have obviously left their effects. You love rock, don't you?
Yeah.
And chiseling away at it and making kind of rough surfaces. I like the sort of elephant corduroy on the first project you showed, was it? The second, the school in England.
Oh, yes.
With the floating, so you're sort of defying the effect of the rock to make it float. Does that effect ever happen in a Swiss valley when you're up there on your skis? Does it ever kind of invert, or the illusions of the mountains and the snow? Is that something that is special for you?
Well, I mean, you know, with my father, we grew up a lot hiking and skinning up the mountain. And what's always amazing is that you can be in the village in clouds and snow. And as you go up, you literally have a sea. And it looks like a lake of clouds. And you have this sense of awesomeness, of floating above the world. And it's such a privileged place to be when you go to these very high altitudes. And with the restaurant, that's what I was trying to recreate with these terraces that seem to be standing on these tiny little poles, and this feeling that you are floating.
The fragility also, that because, you know, you can come crashing down. I've only skied once, and it was on the kids' slopes, but the sense of kind of speed and fragility was palpable.
Yeah.
So you explained that you were referring to quite modest structures made of stone, vernacular structures that you were assembling, and then you were adding these platforms as though they were on the what do you call them?
Tiny legs, stilts.
On what do you use to?
Oh, ski poles. Yeah.
Ski poles. They're kind of on the ski poles, aren't they?
Yeah.
But in reality, there are lots of they're kind of restaurants and places to kind of recover from or kind of build up your strength before you go down the slope.
Yeah.
Is there no ski lift nearby? There must be.
Well, this one is between two ski lifts, yeah. I mean, these restaurants are accessible by foot, so I'll invite you there. How about that?
Okay. And what's the food like?
Well, it depends how much money you want to pay.
Okay. Turning to Alexandria, you delved in. You found that there were amazing things under the sea. And have you actually been snorkeling and adventured? So you're not an archaeologist.
I'm not an archaeologist. No, it was really through the research and you know, I mean, it's very well documented. The other thing is that it was a little bit contentious because the site owner and the client eventually was the Navy, and they were actually not enjoying the fact that this French archaeologist was nosing around, and I think they had quite a few fights. So when I was presenting this to them, I was trying to diplomatically say, maybe there's a solution to this. Maybe you can actually...
So the client was the Navy, but it started off as an opera house. I'm a bit confused on the path.
Well, welcome to Egypt. I can't talk too much about it because I'm not allowed to.
I see.
So.
Well,
but the point is...
Because this is being broadcast all over the world, as Patrick Schumacher found out.
So what I would say is the site is adjacent to the Navy, so we had to be very sensitive to it.
But now it's going to be a museum.
So no. So what happened is it's not going to happen there. But what our client liked the scheme so much that they asked us to do it in another place in Egypt.
But what will it be?
It will be a concert hall rather than an opera.
Okay.
So it's similar, just a little bit more modest in terms of volume, and it's also a waterfront site. And it's culturally very similar. So now we are adapting this scheme to a new function.
And how did you find it? How do you find it working in Egypt as a woman? Is that a problem, or do you just plow on?
No, I mean, I think it's, first of all, it's been incredibly pleasant because I think the Egyptians are incredibly kind and nice people. So it's been...
and incredibly cultivated.
And incredibly cultivated. And you know, you tend to sit in meetings where everybody's an engineer and a builder. And so you know, and maybe sometimes they think that women do more interiors rather than buildings. So I tend to go a little bit more technical when I talk to them, and I tend to go a little bit more, I talk about structures and acoustics and things that maybe I know a little bit more than let's say a road engineer. And so I try to impress them like that, just to first get the right reaction.
You need them to eat out of your hand, of course. Do you have male assistants or female assistants with you? Or whatever?
I don't know. I don't make a difference.
You don't?
No.
Anybody got any questions? Just one.
One question.
They're all a bit shy, and Paul's making kind of wind-up signs to me from the front. So, Christine, thank you so much for sharing your projects with us. Thank you.
Thank you.